Today we're getting into some really foundational stuff. We're looking at F.A. Hayek's collection, individualism, and economic order.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't just, dry theory. It's really the intellectual architecture behind a lot of modern classical liberal thought. It explains why economies work, or maybe why they don't work when we try to force them.
Right. And Hayek kicks things off with a pretty sharp observation, doesn't he? That today, if you actually advocate for clear principles, you get, dismissed.
You do. You get called an unpractical doctrinaire. It's like having strong principles is somehow seen as unrealistic in politics now.
Absolutely. Everything pushes towards this kind of mushy middle ground, this compromise that ends up being neither individualism nor socialism.
And Hayek saw that as dangerous. He argued this constant compromising, this aversion to clear principles, is actually what opens the door bit by bit towards collectivism.
Because you stop defending the fundamental rules.
Exactly. If the basic structure isn't defended, you end up just haggling over specific outcomes, and, well, state control tends to grow in that environment.
It's interesting how that ambiguity really helps those who want more central control. If terms are fuzzy, it's easier to push contradictory ideas.
Right. So our goal here is to cut through some of that fog. We want to follow Hayek's thinking to separate what he called true individualism from false individualism.
And then connect that directly to the economics.
Yes. Critically connect it to the economic reality of dispersed knowledge. If you understand how knowledge is scattered, Hayek argues, you see why central planning isn't just difficult, it's fundamentally irrational.
Okay, so clarifying terms, then linking philosophy straight to the kind of hard mechanics of the economy, where philosophy meets, well, the limits of information. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
All right, let's tackle that word first. Individualism. It's loaded, right? Hayek points out it's used to mean all sorts of contradictory things.
It really is. It's been distorted, often by its opponents, to mean anything from, pure selfishness to almost anarchy. It conjures up this image of someone actively hostile to society.
And it's worth remembering where the counterterm came from.
Yes. The word socialism itself was coined quite deliberately by the Saint Simonians back in the early 19th century, and it was coined specifically to oppose the individualist ideas they saw around them.
Okay, so if that's the distorted picture, what's the genuine tradition Hayek is talking about, this true individualism? Where does it come from?
It's rooted mainly in British thought, particularly the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers and moral philosophers. You're looking at Adam Smith, obviously.
The father of modern economics.
Right. And Edmund Burke, the political philosopher, also figures like Adam Ferguson, Josiah Tucker, and Bernard Mandeville. What unites them is this profound insight into spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order. Okay, that's a big concept. The idea that useful social structures can just emerge without a master plan. That sounds almost chaotic to modern ears, especially when politicians always talk about their plan.
It does sound counterintuitive, but it's not chaos. It's complexity emerging from simple rules followed locally. Hayek emphasizes it's the realization that our most important institutions, think language, money, law, markets, have arisen and are functioning without a designing and directing mind. Nobody sat down and invented English grammar from scratch.
I'd evolve.
It evolved, and Ferguson had that great line, didn't he? That nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the result of human design. We build things without fully grasping the blueprint.
So this tradition is fundamentally humble about the power of reason.
Exactly. Hayek calls it anti-rationalistic in a specific sense. Not against reason itself, but against the idea that one person's reason can grasp and control everything. It starts with an acute consciousness of the limitations of the individual mind.
So we should be humble towards these large, impersonal social processes.
Yes, because individuals acting on their own limited knowledge somehow create things greater than they know, like a global trading network. No single person understands all of it.
So the practical goal here wasn't to find philosopher kings to run things.
Quite the opposite. The goal was a system that does not depend for its functioning on our finding good men for running it. That's such a key point.
Because finding enough good men is impossible.
Or at least unreliable. The aim was to use people as they are, in all their given variety and complexity, sometimes good and sometimes bad, sometimes intelligent and more often stupid. The idea was to create robust institutions, like rule of law and property rights, that give freedom to everyone, not just the good and the wise, because the system itself channels actions productively.
Okay, that paints a clear picture of true individualism. Now let's contrast it with the other tradition, the continental one Hayek labels false individualism. the rationalistic one.
Right. This stream of thought traces more to the French Enlightenment, the encyclopedists, Rousseau, some physiocrats, and its core assumption is basically the opposite. It assumes that any discoverable order must be the product of a deliberate design.
So if it wasn't planned, it can't be truly orderly.
Pretty much. It starts from this Enlightenment, maybe Cartesian, faith in reason with a capital R. The idea that reason is equally available to everyone and powerful enough to construct society logically from first principles.
You can really see the appeal of that, the desire for neatness, for a blueprint.
Oh, absolutely. And Descartes himself provides the perfect illustration. He argued, didn't he, that works designed by a single master are inherently more perfect than things cobbled together by many hands?
Like a city planned by one architect versus one that grew organically.
Exactly. And he extended that, preferring a society designed from the ground up by a wise legislator. It's this view of society as a machine that an expert can and should re-engineer for maximum efficiency based on pure logic.
Okay, here comes the crucial twist, the paradox Hayek identifies. This rationalistic individualism, the one that elevates the individual mind's power to design.
It always tends to develop into the opposite of individualism, namely socialism or collectivism.
Why? How does celebrating individual reason lead to collectivism?
Because if your starting point is that all valid order must be consciously designed, and you look at the messy, seemingly inefficient, unplanned reality of a market economy.
You conclude it's flawed, it needs fixing, by an expert designer.
Precisely. The logical next step is to say, well, these spontaneous social processes clearly aren't optimal. We need to subject them to the control of individual human reason, meaning the reason of the planner, the expert committee, the state, to make sure they serve human ends properly. The very hubris of believing reason can design everything perfectly necessitates central control to impose that design.
So, true individualism. Humility, limits, letting things evolve. False individualism. Hubris, faith in top-down design, leading unintentionally to control.
That's the core philosophical split Hayek wants us to grasp.
Okay, so if the philosophy is about the limits of the mind, let's get practical. Let's connect this to the economy. You mentioned Hayek's biggest contribution here, the knowledge problem.
Yes. This is where the philosophical humility meets hard economic reality. The argument shifts from, should we plan everything, to can we even possibly plan everything?
What's the inescapable fact that makes central planning, according to Hayek, impossible?
It's simply the constitutional limitation of human knowledge. The fundamental truth is that any one person, any single mind or committee, cannot know more than a tiny part of the whole of society. Just a fraction.
And our actions are based only on what we do know.
Our effective actions, yes. Where you work, what you buy, how a manager runs their factory. These decisions are based on immediate effects, local facts, the specific circumstances within the tiny sphere that person actually knows well.
This really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from the usual debates about whether people are selfish or altruistic.
Completely. Hayek says it's almost irrelevant. You could assume everyone is a perfect saint, motivated only by the common good. The system still fails. Because the core issue isn't motive, it's information. The real question is, do we let that saintly individual act based on the detailed, specific, context-dependent knowledge they actually possess about their local conditions, their team skills, their customers' immediate needs? Or do we force them to follow orders from a central planner who claims to have a fuller comprehension of the whole picture, but in reality cannot?
So the best way for someone to contribute is actually by focusing on their own small part of the world, using their local knowledge.
That's the argument. That the great discovery of classical economics was seeing the market, particularly the price system, as this incredible decentralized mechanism that coordinates all that scattered knowledge. It makes individuals contribute to ends which were no part of his purpose.
Okay, to really grasp this, Hayek points out a kind of methodological mistake in how economists sometimes think about data, right? This gets a bit technical, but it seems important.
It's subtle but crucial. It's about the ambiguity of the word data. When we talk about pure economic logic, like the logic of choice for one person,
What does data mean there?
Data refers to the facts known subjectively to that specific person. Their preferences, their beliefs, their expectations, what they know about their immediate options. The logical statements, the tautologies, like people try to maximize utility, only really make sense if data is defined subjectively from the actor's point of view.
But then, when economists start talking about the whole economy, the meaning of data seems to shift.
It often does, yes. Subtly, maybe unconsciously, Data starts to mean the objective facts of the situation as known to the observing economist, as if all the relevant information about resources, technology, everyone's preferences exists in one place, accessible to the analyst.
And that's assuming away the very problem Hayek wants to highlight.
Exactly. It assumes the knowledge problem is already solved before the analysis even begins. The real empirical question for social science isn't what are the objective facts, it's how do the subjective data, the scattered bits of knowledge, beliefs, and plans inside millions of different heads, come to align with each other and with the objective reality out there?
This is where the price system becomes the hero of the story. Hayek's famous example, the tin market, illustrates this perfectly, doesn't it?
It does. It's a brilliant illustration of knowledge communication without central direction. Imagine, he says, some disruption happens somewhere that creates a new scarcity of tin. Maybe a major mine floods or a new use for tin suddenly appears.
Okay.
Now, most users of tin around the world don't need to know why it's scarcer. They don't need reports from the flooded mine or analyses of the new demand.
What do they need?
They just need to know one thing. Tin is now harder to get, and the price system tells them that immediately and concisely. The price of tin goes up.
And that single price change carries all the necessary information.
In a usable form, yes.
Okay.
The higher price acts as a signal, broadcast to everyone who uses tin or produces it or produces substitutes for it. It tells them, economize on tin, find alternatives, look for new sources.
So a manufacturer somewhere might switch to aluminum. Someone else might invest in recycling.
A speculator might anticipate further rises, a producer might work harder to extract more all without knowing the original cause and without anyone telling them specifically what to do. The knowledge gets dispersed and acted upon through the price signal alone. It coordinates millions of actions implicitly.
So economic equilibrium, that state where everything balances out, isn't a starting point. It's more like the destination the market is always striving for.
Precisely. Equilibrium is the state of correct foresight, where everyone's plans are mutually compatible because they're based on accurate expectations of what others will do. The price system is the dynamic process that constantly pushes towards that state, adapting to new information. It's a continuous discovery process.
Which means that standard economic analysis that just assumes equilibrium kind of misses the whole point of how markets actually function day to day.
It misses the most important part.
Yeah.
It misses the process of knowledge acquisition and communication, which is what the market, and especially competition, is all about.
Okay, so if the standard models focus too much on that static endpoint, equilibrium, then the textbook idea of perfect competition must be a major problem for Hayek.
It's the logical endpoint of that static thinking, and yes, he sees it as deeply misleading. The theory of perfect competition essentially assumes away the very function that competition performs in the real world.
How so? What does perfect competition assume?
It assumes things like perfect knowledge by all participants, perfectly standardized products, instant adjustment to any change. Basically, it assumes the end state where all adjustments have already been made.
So if everything is already known and standardized,
Yeah.
what's left for businesses to actually compete on?
Nothing. That's the point. If perfect competition existed, all the activities we associate with the verb to compete, like advertising to inform customers, trying to differentiate your product, searching for cheaper suppliers, innovating a new process would be impossible or pointless.
Because the necessary information gaps or differences wouldn't exist.
Right. There would be nothing left to discover. So Hayek argues, perfect competition is actually a state defined by the absence of all competitive activity. It's a theoretical construct that misses the essence of the real thing.
So real competition is inherently messy,
Yeah,
dynamic, imperfect.
exactly. And Hayek turns the standard view on its head. Competition is more vital, not less, precisely because the real world is imperfect, because knowledge is incomplete, because products and services and locations are all slightly different. These imperfections aren't bugs, they are the features that make competition necessary.
That's the actual economic problem we need to solve, navigating those differences and knowledge gaps.
Yes. How do we find out who can provide a service best, or what the cheapest way to produce something is, or what consumers really want but haven't articulated yet? Competition is the decentralized process society uses to discover these things.
Let's take an example. Hayek mentions things that aren't standardized, like choosing a doctor or getting a specific machine built. My knowledge is limited. How does competition help me there?
It works largely through reputation and brand. Because you can't personally assess the technical skill of every doctor or engineer, you rely on the signals generated by past competition who has a good reputation, which firm is known for quality. Competition for goodwill, as he calls it.
So the competitive process generates information proxies, like reputation, that help us navigate our own ignorance.
Precisely. It fills the knowledge gap. It's a system for learning over time who's likely to serve us well.
And what about finding new efficiencies? You mentioned Hayek's point about a producer who cuts costs significantly, but maybe only lowers prices partially at first. That sounds like gouging to some people.
It might look like it on the surface, but Hayek sees it as a vital part of the discovery dynamic. Imagine an entrepreneur invests heavily, takes risks, and finally figures out a way to cut production costs by, say, 50%. It's a major innovation.
Right.
If the rules immediately force them to cut their price by the full 50%, where's the reward for all that effort and risk? The incentive to innovate in the first place might be drastically reduced.
So the temporary higher profit is the reward.
It's the reward and it's the signal. In a real imperfect market, maybe they cut prices by only 25% initially. That extra profit margin does two things. It rewards the successful discovery, making such exploration worthwhile. And second, it attracts attention.
Other companies see the high profit and try to figure out how to copy or beat the innovation.
Exactly. The profit flags the opportunity. It tells the rest of the market, hey, there's a better way to do things here. This spurs imitation and further innovation, which then drives prices down closer to the new, lower cost for everyone.
So the temporary profit isn't a market failure. It's actually the engine driving the diffusion of the new knowledge and efficiency.
Yes. It's the mechanism that pulls the economy forward into unknown territory. Solving the economic problem isn't like solving a math equation with a known answer. It's always, as Hayek puts it, a voyage of exploration into the unknown, and you need a system that rewards the explorers who find the new routes.
All right, so if the market uses dispersed knowledge and competition as a discovery process, central planning faces the opposite challenge. It needs to centralize that knowledge. And historically, there was this strong belief that central direction had to be more rational, more efficient than the, quote, haphazard interplay of individuals.
That belief was very powerful, yes. The idea that conscious design must be superior to apparent chaos. But Hayek argues this fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the economic problem itself.
How is the economic problem different from, say, an engineering problem?
That distinction is absolutely critical. An engineer typically works with a given single objective: build this bridge, produce X amount of this chemical, maximize output given these specific inputs. The constraints and goals are usually well-defined, technical.
Okay.
The economic problem arises because society has competing goals and limited resources that could be used for any of them. If you use steel and labor to build more cars, you can't use that same steel and labor to build houses or trains.
So there's always a trade-off, a cost.
Always. And it's not just the direct cost, but the opportunity cost, the value of the best alternative foregone. Deciding whether the resources for one MRI machine are worth more or less than the resources for, say, 50 hip replacements isn't an engineering calculation based on physics.
It's about relative values and scarcity.
Exactly. It requires comparing the value derived from completely different uses. And that requires knowing the relative costs, which means knowing the value of those resources in all their other potential uses. That information is generated by market prices, by bids and offers reflecting scarcity and demand across the entire system. Without that, rational calculation is impossible.
Okay, so planners can't just calculate based on technical data. They need economic data, which comes from markets. Let's look at how socialist thinkers try to grapple with this calculation problem. Hayek talks about two closed chapters, two failed attempts. What was the first one?
The first major attempt, or perhaps theoretical dead end, was the idea of calculation in natura, using physical units directly for planning.
So instead of using money prices, the planners would allocate resources based on tons of steel, kilowatt hours of energy, worker hours, that sort of thing.
Yes. Some early socialists and engineers drawn to planning thought this was more scientific, more rational than relying on, fluctuating money prices.
Why doesn't that work? It sounds straightforward.
Because physical units tell you nothing about economic value or scarcity. A ton of coal easily accessible near a factory is physically identical to a ton of coal deep underground, hundreds of miles away. But their economic significance, their cost in terms of labor and capital needed to make them useful, is vastly different.
Right. And physical units can't capture opportunity cost either.
Not at all. If a critical resource, say skilled labor, gets diverted to an urgent new task, the economic cost of continuing its old task instantly rises, even if the physical inputs haven't changed. Calculation in Natra completely ignores the reality of competing human wants and changing circumstances. It just can't make rational trade-offs.
Okay, so that was chapter 1. What was the second attempt? The more sophisticated one, using mathematical economics.
Right. This came from economists like Pareto and Barone. They acknowledged the need for prices, but argued they could be calculated by the Central Planning Board without actual markets.
How?
The idea was, if the planning board somehow knew all the data, everyone's preferences, all technological possibilities, all resource availabilities, they could, in theory, set up and solve a massive system of simultaneous equations. The solution to these equations would give them the correct equilibrium prices for everything.
That sounds incredibly complex, but maybe possible with enough computing power?
Yeah.
Why does Hayek call this an absurd idea?
The sheer scale and dynamism make it impossible. We're not talking about equations for a few hundred goods. We're talking about millions, probably billions, of distinct economic goods. Once you factor in variations in quality, location, time availability, specific states of wear on machinery, individual worker skills.
Okay, the number of variables explodes.
Completely. And crucially, this data isn't static. It changes constantly, every minute, everywhere in the economy. So the planning board wouldn't just solve these equations once. They'd have to be solving them continuously, in real time, incorporating terabytes of new, localized information every second. It's computationally and informationally beyond any conceivable capacity.
So the pure calculation approach failed too. But the debate didn't end there. What about the later attempts, like from Oscar Lange, to create a kind of market socialism?
Yes, this was a clever attempt to sidestep the pure calculation problem. People like Lange, Lerner, and Dickinson proposed a system where the state still owned the means of production, but they'd try to simulate a market.
How would that work? State-owned factory managers?
Exactly. Managers would be government officials, but they'd be instructed to act as if they were in a competitive market. They'd be told, produce up to the point where the price of the output equals your marginal cost and try to minimize costs.
Okay, but where do the prices come from if there are no real markets for factories or raw materials?
That's the key. The prices for capital goods and resources would be decreed by a central planning board, maybe called the Supreme Economic Council, SEC.
And they'd adjust these decreed prices based on, what, trial and error?
That was the idea. If the SEC set the price of copper too low and saw widespread shortages reported by the state managers, they'd raise the decreed price. If they saw surpluses piling up, they'd lower it. They'd iterate towards equilibrium.
Why does Hayek argue this simulation also fails? It sounds plausible, at least for standardized goods.
The core problem is dynamics. The trial and error process assumes the underlying data technology, preferences, resource availability is changing only slowly, allowing the SEC time to gather data, deliberate, and issue new prices. It assumes a world near stationary equilibrium.
But the real economy is anything but stationary.
It's constant flux. Prices in real markets adjust instantly to reflect new information and changing local conditions. The SEC's decreed prices would always lag behind reality, probably significantly. Imagine trying to set prices this way for things that aren't standardized, custom machinery, construction projects, specialized services. It becomes impossible.
And there's another fatal flaw, isn't there? Regarding investment.
Yes, the control over new investment. Even in this market socialist model, the central authority inevitably retains control over allocating capital for new projects, for expanding industries, for adopting major new technologies.
Why is that inevitable?
Because the managers are state officials. They don't own the assets. They don't personally bear the risk of failure or reap the rewards of exceptional success. So how can the central authority trust their judgment on huge, risky, long-term investments?
They can't. They had to double-check everything.
Exactly. The SEC would have to review and approve every significant investment plan, scrutinizing the calculations, second-guessing the manager's local knowledge. This brings you right back to the central planning bottleneck, the impossibility of the central authority effectively assessing millions of context-dependent investment proposals. Risk-taking, innovation, entrepreneurship, they get stifled by the bureaucratic need for centralized approval. The simulated market collapses under the weight of its own internal contradictions.
Okay, so this whole framework, dispersed knowledge, spontaneous order, the impossibility of central calculation, it clearly has massive implications for how we should structure society, for policy. Let's start with the legal framework. What kind of laws does true individualism require?
It points towards a specific and limited role for government and law. The idea is that the state's primary function should be to establish and enforce abstract general rules that apply equally to everyone, like the basic laws of property, contract, and tort. These rules don't tell people what to do in specific instances. They define the boundaries, the protected domains within which individuals are free to use their own knowledge for their own purposes. They delimit spheres of responsibility.
So the government sets the rules of the game, but doesn't dictate the plays. No specific orders like produce this much or use these materials.
Generally, no, because those specific orders override the local knowledge that the system relies on. The focus is on rules that allow people to form reliable expectations about what others will do, facilitating voluntary cooperation.
This connects to something you mentioned earlier, the link between freedom, risk, and reward.
Hmm.
Hayek seems to argue this is a necessary, if sometimes harsh, consequence.
It is, and it's often one of the most challenging aspects of this view for people to accept. To make this system of dispersed knowledge and freedom work, individuals must bear the consequences, the risks of their actions.
And the rewards.
And the rewards must be based primarily on the objective results achieved. That is, on the value that others in the marketplace on their contribution rather than on their subjective effort, merit, or good intentions.
So someone could work incredibly hard on something nobody wants, and in this view, they shouldn't necessarily be compensated for the effort itself, while someone less deserving might strike it rich by luck.
That's the implication. Market outcomes aren't meant to be certificates of moral merit. They are signals. They reflect the perceived value to others. Hayek argues very directly that trying to rearrange outcomes to fit a specific pattern of distributive justice, to match rewards to perceived moral worth, inevitably requires overriding the spontaneous market process.
And that requires
Continuous, detailed intervention by a central authority telling people what to do, how much they should earn, effectively substituting the planner's judgment for individual choice and market signals. He saw this pursuit of perfect distributive justice as incompatible with individual freedom and the discovery process of the market, potentially leading, as he put it, to a new form of servitude.
Let's shift gears slightly to a more macro level, political structure. Hayek discusses the relationship between economic integration and political federation. What's the connection?
He argues that a genuine political federation, like the idea of a United States of Europe, which was being discussed then, absolutely requires deep economic union as its foundation. Specifically, the free movement of goods, capital, and people between the member states.
Why is that essential for political stability?
Because without that free movement, regional economic interests become entrenched and protected, leading to constant conflict between the states over trade barriers, subsidies, and regulations. Economic integration forces a certain level of harmonization and prevents beggar-thy-neighbor policies between the states.
But doesn't that free movement also severely limit what individual states within the federation can do, policy-wise?
It absolutely does. That's a crucial consequence. If capital and labor can easily move across borders within the federation, then any single state that tries to impose, say, much higher taxes or minimum wages way out of line with its neighbor's productivity or costly regulations.
We'll just see businesses and workers leave.
Precisely. The free movement acts as a powerful check on excessive interventionism at the state or regional level. It imposes a kind of competitive discipline on the governments themselves.
And there's another layer related to planning, right? About shared values.
Yes. Effective, detailed economic planning requires a high degree of consensus on fundamental goals and values. What are our priorities? What trade-offs are acceptable?
And in a large, diverse federation, different cultures, histories, economic situations, achieving that deep consensus is much harder than in a small, homogeneous nation-state.
Much harder. Therefore, Hayek concludes, for a diverse federation to actually work and hold together, the scope for central economic planning must be less than what might be possible in a single nation. The very diversity that federation encompasses necessitates less government intervention overall, particularly from the central federal authority. Federation constitutionally limits centralized economic power.
Before we wrap up, let's touch on two specific economic points Hayek raises, almost like detailed illustrations. First, the Ricardo effect. This sounds quite counterintuitive regarding investment during booms.
It is counterintuitive to the simple view that low interest rates always mean more investment in heavy capital. The standard idea is, boom starts, profits are high, firms invest in the biggest, most durable machines.
Right.
But The Ricardo effect suggests that if product prices rise much faster than wages during the early phase of a boom, the opposite might happen temporarily.
Firms invest in less durable, less capital-intensive methods. Why?
Because the immediate profit margin on selling the final product becomes extremely high relative to the cost of labor. This makes time incredibly valuable. Entrepreneurs are incentivized to use methods with a faster turnover, methods that get product out the door now to capture those high margins, even if the equipment wears out faster.
So they choose a quicker, maybe flimsier production process over a slower, more durable one because the immediate profits are just too good to wait for.
Exactly. The opportunity cost of waiting for the highly capitalized, long gestation period project to come online is too high when short-term profits are soaring. This focus on rapid turnover can actually lead to a decrease in demand for the highly specialized, durable capital goods, potentially causing trouble in those heavy industries, even as the consumer goods boom continues. It shows investment isn't just about the interest rate, it's about the complex relationship between prices, wages, and the time structure of production.
Fascinating. Okay, one last nugget. His proposal for monetary stability, a commodity reserve currency. What was the problem he saw with gold, and how would this alternative work?
He saw the gold standard as flawed, partly because gold supply adjusts too slowly to economic needs, and partly because its value relies on tradition or prejudice, not necessarily fundamental stability. His alternative was a currency backed not by gold, but by a fixed basket, a commodity unit, of various essential storable raw materials.
Like wheat, copper, rubber, tin.
Yeah.
A mix of basic goods.
Yes, a representative bundle. The key is that the monetary authority would commit to buying or selling this entire unit of commodities at a fixed price in terms of the currency.
So the currency would be directly convertible into this basket of physical goods and vice versa.
Correct. And the effect would be to stabilize the aggregate price level of those basic commodities.
How does that help stabilize the wider economy? What's the mechanism during a downturn?
If general economic activity slowed down, demand for raw materials would fall and their prices would start to drop. But as the price of the commodity unit fell towards the guaranteed floor price, the monetary authority would automatically step in and buy the commodity units, issuing new currency in exchange.
So instead of letting commodity prices collapse and resources sit idle,
The authority accumulates stocks of raw materials, putting a floor under their prices, and, importantly, stabilizing the incomes of raw material producers. This injects liquidity precisely when needed and prevents a deflationary spiral at the base of the economy, making severe depressions less likely. It aims for automatic stabilization based on real goods, not bureaucratic discretion. #tag outro.
wow, okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground there. If we were to boil it down, Hayek's framework in individualism and economic order really gives us two massive takeaways. First, that crucial difference between true individualism, the one that respects spontaneous order and emerges from humility.
And false individualism, the rationalistic kind that insists on top-down design and paradoxically leads towards collectivism. That philosophical distinction is foundational.
And second, underpinning all of it is the inescapable economic reality, the knowledge problem, the fact that essential economic knowledge is radically dispersed, localized, often tacit, making effective central planning simply impossible.
Right. The market, for all its imperfections, remains the only known mechanism capable of discovering and coordinating that dispersed knowledge dynamically.
So let's leave our listeners with that final provocation from Hayek himself. He asks, the great question at this moment is whether man's mind will be allowed to continue to grow as part of this process of spontaneous order, or whether human reason is to place itself in chains of its own making.
That image is powerful, isn't it? Reason in chains, it really pushes you to think. Where in our world today do we see these systems of spontaneous collaboration working well? Maybe things like open source software development or intricate global supply chains or even prediction markets, systems using decentralized knowledge.
And then the crucial follow-up question.
Are those very systems, those engines of discovery, currently under threat? Threatened by that same rationalistic impulse, Hayek warned about the desire for more control, more conscious design, more centralization, perhaps justified by appeals to fairness or efficiency, but ultimately risking putting reason back in those chains.
It's a vital question to keep asking. A fantastic framework to think with. Thanks so much for unpacking all of that.
It was my pleasure. A lot to think about there.
Absolutely. Until the next deep dive, keep questioning.